Hello, everyone. Has anyone noticed that the kids might not be all right? I suspect we are starting to see the beginnings of the biggest gap in ability in human history, meaning the gap in general competence between two people is going to be the widest it has ever been, which is shocking given how narrow that gap had gotten relative to the rest of human history. But more on all that soon. What first clued me in personally were young people were coming into my office. I worked in like an apartment complex leasing office. And so I've handed quite a few people leases for them to read. And while a lease is a somewhat complicated document, it is one that an adult should be able to understand most of the words on. But I was starting to see people that couldn't comprehend it at all. And they couldn't comprehend like the rules. They didn't really seem to understand anything about the world. And some of them just flat out couldn't read, like they didn't know what the words were. So people talk about like a lot about like not being able to meaningfully read, meaning if you read a paragraph, you knew what most of the words were, but you didn't understand what the paragraph was trying to say. Which that's a bigger problem. That's definitely more common. But there's even some people that just really, if a word is beyond like 9 letters, they're not going to have any idea what it is. And when I worked in the government housing, it got so bad that I was starting to have to read the lease aloud to them. And then a policy changed, and I was made to read all the leases aloud because it was so common, and they didn't want anyone to feel embarrassed by having to ask, like saying, like, "Oh, I can't read. Can you read it to me?" Which perhaps a little embarrassment is due. Although, I mean, it's not really their fault, but they need to. I mean, someone needs to know something's wrong, I guess. But I had to read the lease aloud to them, which I thought was crazy. It's 40-page document or whatever, and just have to read the whole thing to them. It was kind of miserable, but whatever. And anyway, but I was, finding, beyond not really being able to understand paragraphs, they didn't really seem to know anything about anything. And I was kind of curious how these people function at all. Especially there's so much fine print that you need to read in this era not to be completely screwed over by the numerous scams and predatory systems we have. It's like I'll give you a little story. When I was I guess I was 18 or 19 when I was first starting college. I had applied for financial aid, and one of the things that I guess I had signed was to get it was like something like $1,000 a semester of aid, but it was a loan. And so I was also taking out like a different student loan that I understood better, but this one was just $1,000 added to it, and I didn't really understand that. And after I quit taking out student loans, this thing continued to happen. So each semester I had a $1,000 debt piled on. And by the end of my time in schooling, it was like $8,000 or something. And so I found this out, towards the end, which you could say is like on me for not monitoring things more closely. But during my time in college, student loans were frozen, so I had like paid some on it, and especially like my first year, which I think they weren't frozen during, I'd paid quite a bit on it. But towards the end, when it was frozen, I wasn't really monitoring it. It was just kind of is what it is. But by then, I had this $8,000 debt, and I asked my financial office, and they're just like, "What do you mean? You agreed to this? It gets applied every semester, apparently forever," which I just thought was kind of insane. But there's a lot of little nonsenses like that people go through. They're not reading the fine print. They're not really understanding what they're getting themselves into. And by the way, I was perfectly fine. And $8,000, it wasn't the end of the world. And it also, I mean, it's not like it was stolen from me. It was applied to my education. But there are more predatory examples of this. A pretty common thing that would happen in these apartments were people that just like took out unbelievable loans to buy cars they couldn't afford. And then they would have the car for a few months and it would get repossessed, and there's a bit of a scam afoot. And but this sort of thing is just so common. There's so many scams around, so many legal scams. If you can't read in a way that you deeply understand what you're reading, you're gonna have such a hard time. It's just the world is not set up for people who cannot read well. But they're not even the most dysfunctional people, because the some of the younger people I was seeing, like the children, it's like they weren't even fit to be out in public. They all had some kind of like condition that their parents said that they would have, like some reason that they can't behave, some reason they can't, succeed socially, but not reason enough for them to be on, you know, lifelong financial aid. So it's kind of like, maybe y'all need to start finding a compromise, finding a way for your child to succeed. But that never really happens. But I have these children come to my office, they'd be completely out of control. They'd literally jump on my desk. Like, I'd have kids that would come in, jump straight, like, on top of my desk, and I'd just be looking at their parents like, hey, do something. Your kid's wild, do something. And they never would, of course. And I even had one that he'd come in and he'd bite the chairs, and he would just be chewing on the chairs. He was more normal than a lot of the other ones, like, as far as, like, talking to him, but he would chew on the chairs. Anyway, and my boss was there one day, and she's like, you should have offered him a snack. He must have been hungry. He's so hungry he's eating chairs. And it's like, no, he's a feral child. Just he bites everything. And he wasn't a little kid either. He was like 8 or 9 years old, by the way. But it's not just me noticing this either. Ask any teacher, and they'll tell you the behavioral problems have gone out of control. However, also, I know some kids that are miles ahead of any that I've ever seen, far ahead of like where my peers and I were when I was their age. So, like, let's take 2 fifth graders. One has been brain fried by an iPad since she was 2 years old. They have no attention span. Their diet is garbage. I mean, read the labels on food that's marketed at children at the grocery store, and it's absolute insanity. It's like these children are going to need their foot sawed off at like 25. It's diabolical. And they're on some like mind-altering drug because, they can't sit still, and that means they need to be pumped full of something, I guess, which is insanity, and it doesn't really seem to be working either. And they attend a school where the teacher can't even teach because the kids are so out of control. So they're just like at the asylum mixed with a prison when they go to school. It's basically how it plays out. So this is a recipe for someone who is maladjusted socially and can't even read. Okay, so but now let's look at another 5th grader. This one has parents who are more attentive to things, and they are eating healthier than any kid in modern history. They are part of a bunch of youth programs, many of which teach them various life skills. And on more traditional academics, they are years ahead of their peers. So one kid is generally dysfunctional, combined with a lifelong, poor diet, so their health may not be the best either. And the other has a bunch of like life skills alongside an advanced education with the healthiest diet in human history. Might as well be 2 different species. I like, how's this going to play out? And it's actually worse than the gap between nobles and peasants. Peasants had 0 education and could not read, but they could do everything they needed to survive, along with, various trade skills. You usually, you knew the trade skills to upkeep, your farm or whatever you did, as well as, whatever skill your family did. Meanwhile, nobles learned to read, maybe learn some sort of arts, theology, and administrative skills. So noble has a more envious position for sure, but the peasant was not without merit or purpose. And I know having attentive parents has always been a huge advantage, but even the worst parents would get a child who can read because public education was good enough for at least that. And this isn't a video like just all about public education. That really kind of deserves its own topic, but I'm gonna have to mention it a lot because of what we're talking about. But so what we're really seeing is a noble who can do a trade skill versus a peasant who can't even grow a potato, except they're both from the same neighborhood and have parents of similar economic status. And of course, naturally, more wealthy families are having these better education outcomes because these things do kind of, it behooves you to have a parent who is like stay at home or part-time if you want to engage in these alternative ways of raising your children. And healthier, foods tend to be more expensive as well. But it's still doable. I live in an area that is very far from wealthy, and I know plenty of people who are doing it and making it work. But that's not really the point of the video. So I just kind of wonder what's going to happen in the somewhat near future when there are a ton of adults who aren't even fit for the most basic job. Like, again, ask any teacher if the kids they're sending out into the world are fit to do anything. Because, they're not fit to even do like the lowest skilled labor because they're so maladjusted socially. So, when you compare this to most of these so-called like bad kids from, 10, 15 years ago, they were not anywhere near this dysfunctional. Like, for one, they could read. but also they tended to have a lot of friends. Like they were often among the more popular kids at school. And most of these people went on to get like blue collar jobs or what I call charisma jobs like sales. And really, traditional education just didn't suit them, but the education was not, which the education system was not set up to deal with them properly either. It's always been, something that very much caters to like well behaved girls, if we're being honest. But I'm getting off track. My point is these people could still read. They could still make friends, which means they still have it's easy for them to fit into the world. Now, however, it doesn't really seem to be performing that well for anyone. Even a naturally docile, academically minded child is just going to be drowned out by the insane environment of modern education. I spoke with one teacher who said they put the children who want to learn at the front of the class and just kind of let the rest of the room become a zoo. So it's like, I just wonder what kind of what kind of education is that person really getting? Like the good child, like what the good child? I know I should be using these words good and bad because it's not really what's going on here. What kind of education is that child getting? And it's like they go to lunch and they're just like in the full zoo insane asylum, and behind them is the insane asylum zoo. It just can't be good for them. And even even that like academically minded child, they're just if they go home and they just doom scroll for hours, are they going to turn out okay? I just kind of wonder what's going to happen. I guess I won't have to wonder for too long because these people will be everywhere like within 10 years. More of them are trickling out, day by day. And I actually saw some of them in, when I was working in housing, like they would come through and get an apartment, like the 18, 19-year-old types. They'd come through and get an apartment a lot of times with a family member, and they would just kind of like struggle to, they'd struggle to get a job. And I was kind of thinking like, are they going to figure it out? I don't really think so. I would try to hire people to like do little jobs around the complex for a small amount of money, which was really, kind of somewhat secretly part of a jobs program to get things on their resume. Like as far as government housing, that's how it would be. Although I did this at non-government housing too. But, they could put me on their resume and I'd try to help them get a job later. But it's like, even for some of the really basic stuff, they just couldn't do it. They'd come in and have like they need like special requirements. Like for one of the jobs is to just take the trash sticker and go around and pick up mostly like open bags that people had tossed out and like fast food bags and fast food cups. And you just go around the complex and hit them with the sticker and put them in like the trash sticker. What's it called? The grabber. And you'd put them in a bag, and that was the job. And you'd get some money for that, and I would go on your resume as someone that and as an employer, and help you get a job and make you sound good. But these people, it was so unbelievable. These people, they just like would come into the office all the time and need like special accommodations for this. And it's not like they weren't like in a wheelchair or anything. Like they just come and have all these problems with it, They'd have these problems with it, things they wouldn't want to grab with the sticker. With the grabber, I mean, just feel like, okay, like just quit doing it then. I don't know what to say. Anyway, another little anecdote. I shouldn't get distracted like this. But I've talked to some other people about this and I've gotten mixed responses. Some people have this mindset that eventually everything will work out and nothing is truly wrong, which I think is mostly because they are afraid of looking any problem in the face. These are the people who really don't want anyone to be held accountable. They truly want to believe everything is fine so they don't have to experience any sort of conflict ever, which I'm a little empathetic towards this. I mean, I'm definitely someone to say like, everything will be fine. Don't worry about it. But with a lot of things, that's just not true. And I think this mindset is kind of heavily ingrained in them because we've been told, like the country's in like a gazillion dollars of debt and it's totally fine. We'll just print more money. And it's always this, we just kick every problem down the road and the problems get bigger, but they don't ever reach this unsustainable level, at least not yet. So I think a lot of people just think that nothing's ever going to really go wrong. And I think this education issue is definitely one that is not going to be that way. Anyway, those people never have anything useful to say, as in my opinion. But others seem to think it'll be okay because AI is coming to save us, and oh boy, do I think those people are wrong. What a funny coincidence, because I think that might be my next video topic. But to these people, like, they see the class of more elite people brewing, like these people who are learning all of these skills at a young age, and they're like, those are the ones who are going to be like the administrators, and then everyone else is just going to be like a leech, but it'll be okay because of AI. Which is complete insanity, I think, total fantasy, but all my thoughts on that will be in another video. And of course, I've got a lot of conspiracy-minded people in my circle who think this is all a plan to make people dumb and thus easier to control, but I disagree. The people who grew up from like the 1950s to 2005 believed literally anything they saw on TV while also making good workers. Which, as far as any sort of evil cabal is concerned, like, doesn't that make them the perfect people? Like, if I was running the cabal, I would not want people that are, like, unable to do anything, which I think is what we're getting. You know, why would you want, like, why would it, what's the goal with that? You know what I mean? And also, these people, some of these people, I mean, they're going to be kind of feral. Like, they're not going to be easy to control, you know? So, I don't think that's the case. I don't think anyone's thinking. You know, I suspect there is no plan. The systems are decaying and no one really knows how to fix it. And now people are coping that humans won't even be needed. So it's all going to be okay. How wrong they are, but look forward to the AI video. Anyway, I think that's all for this one. I don't have it ready yet, but I am going to put some community things. Maybe on my next video, we'll get some community things going, because I'm a big believer in community. And, you know, all these more advanced education things, these homeschooling, these, I don't know what you call them there. It's like these alternative ways to raise your children that are coming out now. It's like homeschool with like a more focus on community and all this that's happening. It's very interesting. I think it kind of is showing like there is a lot of power in community. This is very important. You know, don't just send your children to public school and abandon them, you know, even if you can't afford to. You know, if you can't afford, like, the better food, at least avoid the poison. And even if you can't afford to, like, homeschool your children or send them to private school or, you know, give them some sort of supplementary education, get them part of something. You know, you need to get them involved in things outside of just, like, throwing them to the state and hoping that it all gets figured out. Because it's not going to get figured out. But if you're watching this video, then I don't need to tell you that, I'm sure. Anyway, see y'all in the next one, which maybe won't be about AI. There's a lot of topics I want to talk about. But, bye.